Thank you. Could you ask Mr. Kuszell to come back, please? Right, Mr. Kuszell, have you got some lunch?
A light lunch. Thank you.
Right, are you ready to carry on anyway?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kuszell.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you now about the circumstances in which Mr. Crawford, Neil Crawford, took over from Mr. Sounes in July 2014? Did that mean that there was if one casts one mind back to the redundancy of Mr. Reck and perhaps others in the December of 2013, does that mean that there was a 7-month gap between Mr. Reck being made redundant and Mr. Crawford taking over from Mr. Sounes?
The first correction I would make is the term takeover, which suggests that Bruce Sounes stopped acting on the project, which wasn't the case.
All right, fair enough, fair qualification.
Yep.
Before July 2014, and let me see if I can approach it in stages. Before July 2014, we know we had Mr. Sounes on the project, yes?
Yes.
There were other people on it as well, including Mr. Reck.
Yes.
Who else was working on the Grenfell Tower project prior to July 2014?
I was, as I responded before, there's a long list of people who worked on the project over a period of in excess of 4 years. I cannot reliably here, without reference to the list, or even if I could refer to the list, tell you exactly who worked on the project when. If you want accurate questions to that, you need to ask Bruce, who I'm sure will recall much more clearly who was working when on the project. I can reassure you that it wasn't just Thomas, Reck and Bruce who were working on the project. So if I've answered that part of the question, what's the next part of the question? Sorry to ask you again.
Well, when Mr. Reck, let's see, when Mr. Reck was made redundant in December 2013, did anybody take over the role that Mr. Reck was playing?
I'd like to just qualify. You are actually asking me about a period of the project when I was not actually directly hands-on involved in the project. Okay, so that is why I'm actually answering you with, shall we say, a lack of the sort of clarity that you're seeking. Because there were so many people, and I don't want to give you a misrepresented name for this stage, but my understanding of the project at that point in time was it had gone out to tender, which is usually a quieter period for us because other than responding to tender queries and maybe tidying up some information, it's a period of lesser activity than one would have immediately preceding it. So the fact that Thomas Reck was not long on the project, I don't think is the be-all and end-all at that stage.
Right. As at December 2013, let's take a step back, what was your role on the Grenfell Tower project?
My role was in the background. I mean, I had handed over the management of the project to Bruce, and if there was an issue that Bruce felt that I needed to be involved in, I would get involved in it. So obviously, if you raise something with me that is somewhere in the evidence that shows that Bruce was requiring input from me, I will answer that.
Right, well, just focusing on that point in time, what were you supervising Mr. Sounes' management of the Grenfell Tower project?
But I wasn't supervising it. I was a director available to Bruce if he had any queries. I mean, we were working flat out on the Calc project, and my role in the Calc project was much more hands-on. And there were other issues that I had to deal with as a director within the practice. So the whole point of having somebody as senior as Bruce was that he could actually manage the project, and that we had a reliable working relationship which had evolved over, at that point in time, 12, 13 years. And I relied on him entirely to come to me if there was an issue.
I see. So would it follow from that there was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, when I try and summarise your evidence, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, I
No.
just want to see if I've understood it.
Yes.
That there was nobody at Studio E who was supervising Mr. Sounes' work on the project, but that essentially you and perhaps other partners were available as a resource as and when he needed it. Is that a fair summary of what you've told us?
I don't know about a resource because Bruce was leading the project and he had resource beneath him to resource the project as was necessary. If any issues arose, either inside the practice or outside the practice, that warranted me to get involved, I would get involved. So I would say that if anybody in the client organisation, for example, had a concern about what was happening on the project, they would come to me as the director that they knew was associated with the project at a higher level.
During Mr. Sounes' management, and take December 2013 as a convenient moment for the question, was anybody regularly looking at Mr. Sounes' management of this project and making sure that it was going well and properly and safely?
I think that it would be one thing if Bruce was in an entirely different office and remote from me and others in the practice. But that wasn't the case. We were actually in the same studio. I could actually overhear any single conversation, and I'm sure of those people who've worked in an open studio environment, you are aware when there is any issue arising. So I think you could say that in that sense there was constant supervision of what was going on.
Let me ask the question a slightly different way then. Who, if anybody, was formerly Mr. Sounes' line manager in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
If he had to come to anybody above him, he would come to me, and then it would be effectively me and the board.
You've answered the question.
May I just, I think really, Mr. Kuszell, the question that Mr. Millett is asking you to focus on could be put in a slightly different way, which is, did you regard yourself or anyone else as being responsible for checking on the way that Mr. Sounes was running the project? I think that's your point, isn't it, Mr. Millett?
The way we operate when a project is with any director or associate in the practice is that there are moments when project information is reviewed under our ISO 9001 procedures. So both at the design stage and the technical stage, there are reviews that are held. And in a sense, they are a checkpoint. But yeah, does that kind of answer the...
Well, I think it does. What I'm understanding from what you're saying is that Mr. Sounes was left to run the project, but that there were these points at which there were reviews.
Yeah, there are always back checks within the practice. But I mean, I have to tell you that when by the time you are an architect in your sort of early to mid 40s, you are arguably at your most experienced and most powerful. You could argue that people who getting to my age are beginning to wane a little bit. So to suggest that actually Bruce was in some shape or form requiring my supervision on his daily activities, I think is a travesty of the reality.
How many design reviews do you recall taking place on the Grenfell Tower project?
I recall one design review which involved me and one of my at that stage co-partners prior to the appraisal panel, which is the architect's appraisal panel. When we sat down to review the project, it was quite a broad review in terms of the overall project status, but with a focus for what was likely to arise in front of the architect's appraisal panel. I'm also aware, because there is a central register that we maintain as part of our procedure, that there was another review held in early 2013, which was also a design review, which I didn't attend.
And the date of the first review was when?
I think it was November 12,
Right.
immediately before the appraisal plan.
So is this right? There were two design reviews in respect of the Grenfell project, November 2012 and early 2013. Is that right?
I think one was, I'm pretty certain it was November 12, because that was when the AAP occurred. And I think the second review was early in 2013.
And apart from that, any other design reviews?
No, there were two design
Two
reviews.
design reviews. And what about a technical review? Was there a technical review?
There was a technical review much later.
When was that? Do you remember?
It was in October 15.
So do I take it from your evidence that apart from the two design reviews in November or so, 2012 and early 2013, and a technical review in October 2015, Mr. Sounes was basically left to get on with it?
Not entirely, because you did ask about Neil Crawford joining him, which he did in the summer of 14.
Right. So up to the summer of 2014, with that qualification, am I right in saying that Mr. Sounes was basically left to run the project?
He was running the project with as many team members as he required.
Now, when Mr. Crawford took over, I say took over, when he came into the project, let me try and use a less provocative expression, in July 2014, do you remember whether there was any kind of handover process as between Mr. Sounes and Mr. Crawford, from what you recall?
I recall that there were discussions between them, and there was no question of Bruce just stepping aside. He was still very much engaged in the project, while Neil was, shall we say, getting a grasp of the project.
Whose decision was it to bring Neil Crawford into the Grenfell Tower project?
It was a joint decision between Bruce and myself. By the summer of 2014, the Aldridge Academy was nearing completion, and it was a question of how we would redeploy Neil, and we both thought that Neil was the best candidate to come in to help, because first and foremost, he actually had experience of working on high-rise buildings with his previous practice. Second, he actually knew the context of the project, having worked on the Aldridge Academy, and he was coming available. So given his experience, which was considerable, and the nature of the project, it was a logical decision.
Did you take any steps to find out, satisfy yourself, whether Neil Crawford had sufficient technical competence to take over or take the role on, such as he had on Grenfell Tower?
Neil had been working within my group since he joined the practice. And he came to our practice having been made redundant at Foster's, but had actually been an associate for a number of years at Foster and Partners. We were jolly lucky to get him. He was an extremely competent individual. He immediately recognized as one of our better and more experienced people in the practice. So he was made associate fairly quickly. And I had absolutely no doubts that he had the ability to make a significant contribution to the project.
Let me be more specific. When you decided, you and Mr. Sounes together decided to bring Mr. Crawford into the project, did you investigate what experience Mr. Crawford had in an overcladding of an existing high-rise residential
I don't
tower?
think he had experience of an overcladding of an existing building, but he definitely had high-rise design experience on both commercial and residential type buildings.
Now, can you help me? Mr. Crawford, I think, was not an RIBA qualified architect, was he?
He didn't finish his Part 3.
No. Can you explain why Mr. Crawford, who had not finished his RIBA Part 3, was allocated to the day-to-day management of Grenfell Tower, as he was in the summer of 2014?
Well, first of all, the fact that he wasn't qualified Part 3, I think, doesn't reflect on his ability and skill. As I said to you, I think you can see by the white hair how long I've been practicing. I've met a lot of architects through the years. I would rank him in absolutely the top 5% of people I've actually worked with. So I have absolutely no embarrassment to say that we would have confidence in him. However, recognizing that he hadn't finished his Part 3, ages ago, he was working to Bruce, and Bruce was there in a direct supervisory position. So just as you were asking whether I was a supervisor to Bruce, I don't think I really was. I do think that Bruce was a supervisor to Neil. And without putting words in Bruce's mouth, I think the respect for Neil is as considerable as mine.
Did you consider at the time did you specifically consider at the time whether appointing Mr. Crawford to the job that you did in the summer of 2014 was consistent with Studio E's ISO 9001 procedures?
I'm not aware of any procedure offhand without referring to it. It's a voluminous document, but I don't think I have any reason to believe that we couldn't have used Studio E on the project if Bruce remained on the project.
My question really is, did you think about it at the time?
In all honesty, no, because our confidence in him was really quite considerable.
Now, can I ask you a different set of questions about Studio E's financial position? We know that in August 2014, Studio E LLP was placed into creditors' voluntary liquidation. We've confirmed that before.
Yes.
Yes. And Studio E Limited then took over the Grenfell Tower project. Was it the case that there was a limited staff available to work on the Grenfell project after the insolvency of LLP? Or a more limited staff, perhaps?
No, not really. I think we had the numbers that were required to actually manage the project. And in fact, given that the two seniors remained with us, and I, from memory, although again I'd ask Bruce to confirm that when you speak to him, I seem to remember we had one other member of staff who had also worked on Grenfell prior to that.
Yeah. Let me try and do it this way. At the moment when Studio E LLP went into voluntary creditors liquidation, how many available fee-earning staff did you have?
Again, I'd need to refer to documents because there had been some redundancies at the end of 2013. So if you want an accurate answer to that, I'd have to go back.
Just in general terms.
No, sorry, I just would need to check. Because either you want a wrong answer or you want a right answer. If you want the right answer, I really cannot tell you. We would have probably been around about 30 at the very least.
Right. My question was really a general question. Do you remember, to the best of your recollection, whether the staff employed by Limited after LLP went into liquidation was smaller than the staff employed by LLP at the moment it went into liquidation?
It had nothing to do with the liquidation. The issue of how many staff we had was more to do with the character of the work that we had to undertake.
Yes, I'm just trying to get a feel, really, for a comparison of sizes of staff.
I think you're
Are you able to help me with that?
Yes, I think
Right.
You're trying to get sizes for a project that goes through different stages, demanding different level of resource. So I think it would have peaked at the point of tender, and I'm pretty sure that it wasn't just Thomas Reck. We were working with Bruce. We did maintain staff after that in preparation for the construction start. And we maintained the right level of staff for the project once it moved into 2015.
Let me ask this question one more time, because maybe you misunderstood it. I'm not asking about the project. I'm asking about Studio E,
Yes.
the practice.
Yes.
When Studio E LLP went into liquidation, what were the same numbers, or were the staff that you had at that moment transferred over
No.
to limited?
No.
Right. What happened to the staff who
A lot were made redundant.
How many?
Well, again, you're asking me specific number questions, and I really cannot recall. If I'd had prior knowledge of the question, I would have checked for you, but I cannot tell you these numbers offhand. It was 6 years ago, and it's difficult to remember such numbers.
Now, the insolvency process itself, was that time-consuming for you?
For me, it would have occupied a considerable amount of my time, yes.
What about Mr. Sounes? Did that occupy
No,
his time?
much less so. It was mainly the fate of the partners and directors to sort it out.
I see. Do we take it from that in fact the insolvency itself didn't have any adverse impact on any particular project?
If you're asking whether it had an impact on Grenfell, I don't think it did.
Any other project?
The projects that went with us to limited with the agreement of the client organizations, no. In fact, really, the truth is that they wouldn't have run with us unless we were going to resource the project.
Now, I'm going to ask you a number of questions about ISO 9001.
Yes.
Are you familiar with ISO 9001?
Yes.
The Quality Assurance ISO?
Yes.
Yes. Can I ask you to look, please, at paragraph 23 of your statement? That's at SEA 000-14271 at page 6, please. And we looked at this before. You say in the first sentence there, the practice is an ISO 9001 quality management system and ISO 14001 environmental management registered company. These management systems set down procedures under which the practice operates, both for managing the practice's operation and its project design work. So just to be clear, the question is, at the date of your statement, Studio E Architects Limited was, I think, just to be clear, ISO 9001 registered.
Yes.
It was. And that is that a standard against which any quality management system can be measured vis-à-vis third-party accreditation?
I'm not sure I understand the question. It certainly was the standard that we were being measured by, and I understand that a lot of organizations will establish an ISO 9001 system, usually using an outside agency to help them set the system up.
And a third party to accredit it?
Well, yes, in our case, I think, but I can't be absolutely certain because it was set up in 2005, whether we had the same people auditing us throughout, but it was audited annually.
Yes. And would it be right to describe the ISO 9001 standard, or the purpose of the standard, to help organizations, whether architects or any other organization, to meet the needs of customers whilst also meeting at the same time the statutory and regulatory requirements related to the product or services that you supply? And as a registered practice, is it right that Studio E Limited would have been required to set up a quality management system which was appropriate to its operation?
If we were operating under ISO 9001, we would have a system in place, and we do have a system in place.
Yeah, you say you do. Did you, in the period 2012 to 2016?
Yes.
And turning to LLP, I think that was also registered, wasn't it?
Yes. When we moved from trading from Studio E Architects Limited to LLP, effectively the system was transferred. Obviously, there had to be some modifications, but not major. Basically, the system was the same. So LLP continued under the ISO 9001 and the 14001.
Right. And I see. So when LLP ceased to trade, as we've just discussed, was the registration then transferred back to Studio E
Correct.
Limited? It was. And were you personally involved in that transfer process?
No, at the time, my colleague, partner, director was in charge of coordinating the registration, and he, together with our office manager, notified the auditors that we were transferring back from the LLP to Studio E Architects Limited, and then they continued to audit Studio E Architects Limited.
And who was your colleague, partner, director that you've just referred to?
David Lloyd-Jones.
David Lloyd-Jones. Okay. And did you have any involvement in that mechanical process yourself?
The actual transfer at the time, I don't think so. I think it was mainly David at that stage. But obviously, we are all involved in 9001 somehow. So.
Right. Do you remember when the ISO 9001 registration was transferred back to Studio E Architects Limited?
Well, clearly, the LLP suspended activities in July 14.
Yes.
The system that we continued to use, obviously in those first days, would have been the same system as LLP, but it was rapidly adjusted to respect the fact that it was back to Studio E Architects Limited. We had actually also moved premises, so we had to actually adjust it for the new premises. There were one or two other adjustments, and then I think it was audited. And there was prior knowledge. The auditors actually knew that we were doing this, and then they audited us, I think, in January 15.
I see. Was there a gap in time between Studio E LLP ceasing to trade and Studio E Architects Limited taking back the ISO 9001?
No, not really. I mean, bar one person, all the other 8 had been with the practice for, at that stage, 10 or so years. Neil was a little bit shorter, and they'd been familiar with using the ISO 9001 and 14001 prior to it becoming LLP, during it being LLP, and then reverting back to Studio E Architects Limited. So there wasn't exactly a learning curve to understand what the ISO 9000 are required, and indeed the way projects were set up and everything was the same.
Yes. Now, can I just go back to something we talked about earlier on this afternoon, and that's internal reviews. If you go, please, to paragraph 24 of your statement, that's at SEA 000-14271, page 6. We could just have that up on the screen, please. Page 6, you say, and it's there, each project at Studio E usually goes through a number of internal reviews as part of our quality management process, including a design review and a technical review. And you've given us the dates of those earlier on in your evidence. Do you mean to say here that a project would normally go through one design review and one technical review?
Yes.
You do. And ordinarily, would you have expected the Grenfell Tower project, given its size and its complexity, perhaps, to go through more than one design review and one technical review?
Well, it went through 2 design reviews,
Yes.
which obviously also included the AAP review, and it went through a technical review at the point when the team working on it felt that a review was appropriate.
And do you agree that as part of a quality management system which complies with the standards of ISO 9001, that a series of both design reviews and technical reviews needed to be conducted throughout the course of Studio E's involvement in the project, the Grenfell Tower project?
I think the process we follow is that every project that we do is set up on a central register, so we know whether it's been reviewed at a given stage or not. at the time when we got the project, we had a larger staff, and under David, there was an assistant who issued reminders to the project teams as to whether their projects were or weren't ready for review. But ultimately, the decision as to when a project should be reviewed and whether indeed it needs to be reviewed more than once will come from the team, because they will either feel uncomfortable that it hasn't been reviewed, and they will ask for another review if necessary.
Now, if you go, please, to paragraph 24(2) of your statement.
Yep.
You see, top of the page there, page 7. A technical review usually occurs, you say, what was previously RIBA stage EF, technical design and product
Yes.
information. A senior technically experienced member of staff will review a more detailed information pack against a checklist covering all aspects of a project, from status of project information through to its technical content, and including such aspects as building regulation compliance and fire strategy. Now, I've read that all to you, so that you've got the full context. Would you accept that it's part of the architect's role to consider compliance with the building regulations?
Yes.
And that would it checked as part of Studio E's internal design review?
Yes, it would be checked, and they would be looking not only at their own design, but also checking off such things as whether inputs have been made by others.
Yeah. Now, we know that the Grenfell Tower project was put out to tender to potential design and build contractors in late 2013.
Yep.
Remember that? And that was on the basis of stage E information. But and to be fair, I think Mr. Sounes thinks that it was more like stage F1. Do you agree that at that stage, the design work on the project had reached at least stage E, if not stage F1?
I think I'd be more comfortable for you to ask that of Bruce, because I wasn't hands-on in terms of the exact status of the information. I think there were different packages of information, and they would have been at different stages of development. I'm very aware from what Bruce and Neil indeed have reported to me that there was a lot of design actually going on both by us and by others once the contractor was appointed.
Just focusing on this point for the moment, if Mr. Sounes is right that the design work for Grenfell had reached stage E and probably more like stage 1, as Mr. Sounes may say, if that's right, the design work carried out by Studio E should have been, is this right, should have been checked internally for building regulations compliance once the tender documents had been completed.
Again, the timing of all of this, I think you really should ask of Bruce. But from memory, we actually produced a Stage D report in the second half of 2014. And then tender information was prepared to different stages of development at the end of that year. There had been reminders issued about a technical review actually earlier in the year, but the question was whether the project was actually ready to be reviewed, because on the whole you do actually want to review the project that's going to be built as opposed to the project that might be built.
You told us earlier that there'd been a design review in November 12 and a further design review in early 2013.
Yes.
And my question is, why wasn't a design review conducted in late 2013 at the point at which the tender documents were ready to go out?
The purpose of the design review is to highlight strategic issues on a project, and the fact that there were 2 reviews held over a period of, I guess, 15 months would have given the team the steers that they required for the Stage D design. If the if they had felt that they wanted a further review, they would have approached myself and asked for another review. It's not to say that there wasn't an awareness in the practice as to what was going on with the project during the period from early 2013, when the second design review was held and when the Stage D report was prepared.
And you say that a technical review, going back to your statement, usually occurs at what was previously RIBA Stage E and F, or E/F.
Yes.
Technical design and product information. If Mr. Sounes is correct that that stage had been reached by late 2013, at the time when the project was put out to tender, and I'm asking you to make that assumption with me, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
If that's right, can you explain why there was no technical review at that stage?
I can only discern from that the project was still in flux in many areas, and therefore the technical review was not held.
Do you remember whether there was a technical review or a design review based on the documents and drawings which were being sent out to tender?
They would have been reviewed by Bruce at a senior level to ensure that the package was correct. But it didn't at that stage request it wasn't warranting a technical review.
Does that mean that at that stage, completion of the tender documentation and being sent out to contractors, there was no technical review which covered building regulation, compliance, and fire strategy?
Other than within the team itself, no.
Thank you. Right. Can I ask you then to look, please, at a document, SEA 00006047, page 3. Now, this is an email from David Lloyd-Jones, this is the gentleman you mentioned earlier, to you on the 29th or 31st of August, and it responds to an email from you just a bit lower down the page 2 days before. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you say to David and Catherine, that's Catherine Bierman, and this is copied to Bruce Sounes, and indeed Neil Crawford, we would like to schedule in a technical review, Calc/Grenfell, next week. You see that?
Yes.
And then moving up the page, Mr. Lloyd-Jones comes back to you and he says, are you looking for a design review or technical audit? We have no record of a design review for Calc/Grenfell. So at what stage had the Grenfell Tower project reached, which meant that there should be a technical review?
I think that this was part of the reminder process that I mentioned earlier. The assumption that Calc and Grenfell were at the same stage in August 2012 was incorrect, because Grenfell hadn't even, at that point, I don't think it was even gone into planning, let alone reached a technical review stage.
So can you explain why you linked the two together like that by saying technical review, Calc/Grenfell?
I think that probably, in hindsight, was a misunderstanding on my part, because it was clear to me from knowing where the projects were that Calc would have been at a stage where it could be technically reviewed, but Grenfell wasn't. It could have been considered for a design review, which actually did occur a little bit later.
So are you saying that the Calc project was ripe for a technical review,
Yes.
but Grenfell wasn't?
Correct.
Can you explain, perhaps you can't, what it was in your mind that linked the two in that way?
Retrospectively, I can't sorry, but because it's manifestly obvious that Grenfell was not at that developed stage.
And then if you go to next email, up to page 1, we have no record of a design review. I need to move up to page 1. Here it is. I'm so sorry. It's page 2, and it's your email back to Mr. Lloyd-Jones. Oh, I'm sorry, I keep losing it. There it is. At halfway down page 2, and you say, David, I think we might have a combined session, or at least follow one closely by the other. The technical review is particularly important at this stage. As it's hands-on, it's Neil and myself, so we could do it within the group with Bruce.
That's because it's referring to calc.
Well, I was just going to ask you, but the heading, the subject of the email is Calc/Grenfell Technical Review. You're referring to Calc only there.
I am referring to calc.
And that, we can see Neil is involved in it. Does that tell us, does that give us a clue?
Well, Neil was involved in calc.
Exactly. So did a technical review of Grenfell Tower take place at that stage?
No.
No. Now, if you go to your statement, please, page 15, paragraph 54, it's SEA 000-14271, page 15. You can see at paragraph 54, you say in the first line, I was involved in the design review for the project. This was undertaken between me, David Lloyd-Jones, and Bruce Sounes. And then you go on to refer to an email of the 7th of November 2012, a little bit later on. Can I, and I think we've seen that, but what role did Mr. Lloyd-Jones play in the Grenfell project?
He had a negligible role on the Grenfell project, but he, as a design review, it was actually good to have him giving his sort of fresh eye on the project.
Right. And is this the design review that you referred to earlier? This is the Grenfell design review, which you say, I think, did take place in late 2012.
Correct.
I see. And David Lloyd-Jones's role was what, to be essentially an independent and objective peer reviewer?
Yes.
I see. Let's look at the email. We, I think, looked at it earlier. It's SEA. I'm so sorry. SEA 000-14272 at page 34. It's in your exhibit. And if you... right, we need page 34. Right, it's on the screen. If you go to that,
yep.
It's the one from Bruce Sounes to David Lloyd-Jones, I think copied to you, and it says Grenfell Review. Do you see that?
Yes.
And David, have you got time tomorrow to do a design review for Heston? We'd like to do it today, but Stage C is dragging on while we wait for the others to move forward their material. I'm several hours in debt to sleep from Monday and Tuesday. It looks as if this is a different project.
Heston was a different project.
Can you explain how this muddle happened? Its subject is Grenfell Review, but this is about Heston.
I think it's a challenge beyond me. I think you probably ought to ask that question from Bruce, because he obviously had a design review on Heston in mind.
Well, I'm asking you because you respond to it. If you see just above it, you say, yes, what time? You didn't say which project are you talking about. What did you understand he was talking about? Was it the design review for Grenfell?
I can't remember. All I can tell you is that we probably did hold a design review of Heston more or less at that time, but it wasn't that much before the review on Grenfell and the AAP. Okay.
At the stage you did, as you've told us, the design review for Grenfell in late 2012, whether or not this email string refers to it, did you review any technical elements of the project?
On Grenfell, did I review any technical elements of the project? I remember that Bruce did a presentation. He probably was relying on material that he had prepared to be presented to the AEP, which would have actually shown the planning of the building, the surrounds of the building, and studies for the building exterior.
And was any consideration given to compliance with the building regulations at that stage?
This would have been a much more broader and strategic review of the project. It wasn't getting into the technicalities of it. No.
So is the answer to my question no?
No.
Was any consideration given to CDM compliance at that stage?
At that stage, if we felt that there was something which was going to be problematic, it would be raised. So I give you an example of the sort of issue that could arise. We would have thought about the building surrounds, the proposals for re-landscaping. We would have thought about, I think, we may have talked about the apron that was protecting people at the low level, because there was some discussion about omitting it, and we were anxious about that being omitted. So the CDM dimensions would have come in some shape or form, yes.
Can I ask you please to go back to paragraph 21 of your statement, which is in SEA 000-14271 at page 6.
Yeah.
You say there that a design review usually occurs at what was previously RIBA CD, Concept and Design Development, and we looked at this before. And you go on to say that the project lead presents to one or more senior people at Studio E who will consider the proposed design against a checklist of issues with a focus on conceptual, aesthetic and strategic issues.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you a question or two about that. In the case of the Grenfell Tower project, was there any checklist of issues with a focus on conceptual, aesthetic and strategic issues in either the design review in November 2012 or early 2013 that you've referred to?
The review in November was in the context of preparing for the appraisal panel.
Yes.
So we would have covered some of the headers, but I think the review earlier in the following year would have been against a checklist. There are checklists in the practice manual.
I see. So you're saying no for the November, but yes for the early 2013.
As I remember it, we sat down and went through the project with Bruce in the context of the AAP panel. Whether we had the checklist out in front of us at that time, I cannot recall.
Right. Now, you referred earlier in your evidence to a technical review in October 2015.
Yes.
If we go to SEA 000-13508, we can see, once we get it, that it's dated the 28th of October 2015. Is this what you were referring to earlier in your evidence?
Yes.
And this is the, I suppose, note or minute of the meeting on that date. And the project title is Grenfell Tower, Assessor Bruce Sounes, Associate, Project Architect Neil Crawford. And the technical review stage is 4 to 5, which is F/GH, J and K.
Yep.
Am I right in thinking that there was no equivalent set of notes for the design reviews in either late 2012 or early 2013 that you referred us to earlier?
Not that we can locate. We had a big office move in 2014, and I think a critical notebook that belonged to Bruce Sounds actually was lost at that time.
Okay, now looking at this document, if we look at page 2, you see, it says design standards. This is the very foot of page 2. Do you see that?
Yes.
Comment, design to current housing, approved document building regulations, and British standards where applicable. First question is, did you see this note when it came out, when it was produced?
I received a copy of this once it had been completed.
I see. So your involvement in the technical review this technical review was not the review itself, but just receiving a record of it.
Correct.
I see. Let me just see how far we can go then with it, because maybe for Mr. Sounes himself. But if you look at the bottom of page 2, as I've pointed out, it says design standards, and you can see what's said in the comment there.
Yes.
Did you understand at that time that the technical review reviewed whether the design of the Grenfell Tower refurbishment that Studio E was involved in complied with the approved documents under the building regulations?
I would have understood that, yes.
Did you investigate with Mr. Sounes or Mr. Crawford, who was involved, of course, at this point, what
No,
they did?
I didn't. Well, put it this way. I think if one of the benefits of Neil actually joining the project with Bruce was that Neil was actually a fresh set of eyes on the project, a fresh set of experienced eyes. In many ways, he was actually backstopping Bruce because he was acquiring knowledge and questioning what was happening on the project. So between them, they actually carried out this review. And I think if that note had posed a question mark, then yes, I would have been alerted that there was something to infer from this. But the way it's put, I had no reason to believe that there was an issue.
If you just help me with this, if you look at the document as a whole, and I know it's difficult for you, but if you could be scrolled down it gently.
Yes.
Is this a standard format that Studio E has on its system?
It is.
So you would then just fill in as per appropriate for each project?
Yes.
Fine. Okay. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but am I right in thinking that if you go to page 3, under technical performance, you can see in the second from last entry, fire detailing, comment completed, action blank. Is fire detailing the only reference or the only place in this document we would find any review or review report about fire performance?
I think there are parallel documents that actually give you some guidance. But I think the important point here was that, at least this is my understanding, that we had a fire consultant on the project. He had set down the strategic issues that had to be addressed, and that had been completed either by us or by others.
Well, you say that now, Mr. Kuszell, but when you read this, did you look, first of all, at this entry I'm directing your attention to, fire detailing, comment completed?
I would have scanned the document, yes.
Of course. And by completed, what would you have taken, or what did you take from that?
That there were no issues that were outstanding on the fire front. I mean, I know that with hindsight now, you would obviously look at it much more carefully. But at the time, there was every reason to understand that nothing untoward had been discovered.
I see. Is there anywhere else on this standard form document that if there were problems or issues which were outstanding at this stage about fire safety on the project, you would find it?
If you've got a comment and you're unhappy with any aspects of the project, you would write more than just completed in the box.
So that's the box you would fill in if you had a problem?
Well, I to be honest, you'd need to. I can't remember the whole document, but for sure that's the fire side of things. Yes.
Right. All right. Well, if there are any other difficult issues with that or difficulties with that document, we can ask other witnesses. Can I ask you, please, to go to a document RYD 000569556. Bearing in mind the document I'm taking you away from is dated the 28th of October 2015. The document I'm now taking you to is a Ryden site progress report dated October 2015.
Yes.
You see that?
Yes. I do.
Have a look at it. Is this a document you think you would have seen at the time?
No.
Not. If you look at the bottom of the page, in the activity table, you can see there's a box at the bottom that says activity table. Do you see? It says
I do.
External facade works, planned progress 100%, actual progress 60%. You see that?
Yes.
So would it be right to say that the technical review that we saw, which produced the report of the 28th of October 2015, was done when construction of the external facade was already 60% complete?
Yes.
Now, you told us in your statement that a technical review usually happens at RIBA stages E to F. We saw that at paragraph 24.2
Yes.
of your statement. Would it follow from that that the Grenfell Tower technical review took place well after stages E stroke F?
I don't know about well after, but I've spoken to both Bruce and Neil since, and I'm now aware that the project was still under very serious design resolution through the first part of 2015. So both by us and by others. So the question really you ought to be asking at Bruce and Neil is at what point did they feel confident that they were reviewing the final package?
Well, we can ask them lots of questions, Mr. Kuszell. I'm asking you, as a senior person in Studio E at the time, if Mr. Sounes is correct that the project had reached stage E or F1 at the point of tender, if he's correct about that, then the Grenfell Tower technical review, taking place as it did in October 2015, took place a very long time afterwards. Are you prepared to accept that?
Yes, it was after. Good, yeah.
And it was more than a year after the submission of the full plans application to building control.
Yes, but that's actually, that in itself, it doesn't really mean too much because it took us 2 years to get planning approval.
Would it be normal for a technical review to take place when construction of an important element of the project was already 60% complete?
I think that the question of what is normal in these circumstances is rather difficult to define. Different projects follow different processes, and therefore the timing and the completion of design occurs at different stages. So I think what is important is at what point was the project had the project been developed to the point where you would be reviewing the final technical equation.
Do you know, I'll help you if you don't, that the design and the specification, at least for the ACM, the rain screen, took place at latest in September 2014? Did you know that?
I wouldn't have been able to give you that date.
And the cavity barriers at the end of in April 2015.
Right.
You know that.
Again, these are dates that would not be familiar to me.
Right.
And of course, the products that you mentioned and the final detailing of those were being undertaken by others.
And that, let me see if you agree with me, that a technical review taking place in late October 2015, after the ACM had been specified and the cavity barriers had been designed many months earlier, would be happening far too late.
Sorry,
A technical review that happens in October 2015, when the ACM had been specified more than a year before, and the cavity barriers had been specified in April that year, was happening far too late. It's a proposition. I'm just inviting your comment on that.
I'm saying that after the contractor was appointed, a lot of things were changed and design continued under the auspices of a specialist.
Do you know of any reason why the technical review did not happen any earlier than October 2015?
I think that my response earlier still stands, that ultimately my duty at that stage would have been to remind the team working on the project that a technical review was due, and it was their judgment, being hands-on on the project, as to exactly when they held the technical review.
Right. I wonder if we can just then, in the light of that, go back to the minutes of the technical review we were looking at earlier on. That's SEA 000-13508.
Yep.
October, 28th of October 2015. And I showed you this when we looked at the document, but let's just go back to it again. The assessor, you see at the top, is Bruce Sounes, and the project architect is Neil Crawford, yes?
Yes.
Given that Mr. Sounes was essentially the professional at Studio E in charge of running the Grenfell Tower project, was Mr. Sounes not marking his own homework in conducting this technical review?
I think this is hard to call, really, because, as I said to you earlier, Neil had actually joined the project in 2014, and he was the fresh eyes. But by the time we get into 2015, actually, Neil is closer to the daily workings of the project, and Bruce is the one who's actually now checking what is actually happening during the construction stage. So the truth is that the review was actually carried out between the two of them, and it, in fact, that is the only way that a review could be undertaken. So normally, when we do reviews, you have one party who isn't hands-on and the other party who is hands-on. Obviously, the hands-on party actually is there to answer questions to the party who isn't directly hands-on. These were the two most experienced people in our practice, and they carried out the review.
Do you know why? Well, let me ask the question in a slightly more staged way. Would it follow from that there was no peer review of the technical review stage 4 to 5 by somebody at Studio E who was not already involved in the detail of the project?
No, that is true.
Is there any reason why you, for example, or Mr. Lloyd-Jones, for example, could not have been involved or could not have conducted the technical review?
Yes,
What
I
is
think
that?
that I think that we wouldn't have been as technically informed as Bruce and Neil were to actually carry out that review. So, I mean, in effect, we had Neil, who actually worked on tall, high-rise buildings, and Bruce, who had actually done all the legwork to research the project. They were two of our most knowledgeable people.
But would you accept that adopting that approach, that would mean that the only people who were best qualified to carry out a technical review of the work at Studio E were those who had carried it out?
Well, at different stages.
So who would bring any independent eye to bear on the work that Mr. Sounes and Mr. Crawford had done on the Grenfell Tower project as at late October 2015?
Well, I would say that the independent eye that came to the project was at the end of 2014, which was Neil, because he actually was a totally fresh hand on the project.
Forgive me, Mr. Kuszell. I'm going to ask the question again, and I'll try and repeat it verbatim. Who would bring any independent eye to bear to the work that Mr. Sounes and Mr. Crawford had done on the Grenfell Tower project as at late October 2015, when this technical review was done?
I think that the events that occurred between 2014 and 15 were summarized in the report that was produced between the two of them. But I repeat that Neil came as a fresh set of very experienced eyes who didn't know the project. So he would have actually looked at it totally afresh. And the fact that the project then continued to evolve under his fresh eyes was, I think, a good thing.
But he wasn't very fresh, was he, by October 2015? He'd already been involved in it for 16 months.
He was in a good position to judge whether the technical ins and outs of the project at that stage.
Yes, Mr. Kuszell, but not independently, I would suggest to you.
Not in the sense that you mean it, yes.
Thank you. Do I need to ask that? Mr. Kuszell, I've come to the end of my questions, but I have one more for you. Looking back on the Grenfell Tower project and doing the best you can with your recollection and what you know of what you've seen of the evidence, is there anything that you would have done differently in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
I think that the response to this shows a lot of respect to the BSRs who suffered in this tragedy. I would just wish to reflect, since it was the last question that was on the list prior to this, that the technical review, however you feel you want to interpret it, but it didn't actually reveal anything untoward at that stage. And hindsight now comes into play. We've all lived 2.5 years since the tragedy. And doubtless, absolutely every one of us would wish to turn the clock back. And the truth is that through those 2.5 years, a lot of information has come out, some of it through our evidence, but there's also other information that's come out through various sources. I have to say that if we had understood that building regulations were not robust, if we had understood that we can't trust a certification, if we had understood that advice that was being given from parties who were either specialists or marketing products were that unreliable and misleading, this is so sad to say, but I don't think this tragedy would have happened. And it really cracks me up, because it shouldn't have happened. It really shouldn't have happened. And I'm really, really sorry for all of you and everybody else who was involved in the project, because I can only say to you from my heart that we really wanted to do the absolute best project we could. And that's why I didn't enjoy having the project described as an add-on, because in our hearts it wasn't an add-on at all. So it's horrendous. And the only thing that we can wish for now is that actually we contribute as best we can. We've shared absolutely everything with you to finding a way forward which prevents this ever happening again.
Mr. Kuszell, I've come to the end of my questions, but there may be, on reflection, one or two further questions which my team might want me to ask you. So I'm going to ask the chairman to rise for a few minutes.
Now, would it be sensible to combine this with the afternoon break?
Yes.
And so how long do you think you might need to consider the other question?
The length of the afternoon break, which would normally be 10 minutes, should we say?
Well, I was thinking about 25 past 3.
Yes, that's very convenient.
Fractionally over 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Is that going to be all right?
We're keen to get on to the next witness, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
this afternoon, so that's convenient, yes.
Mr. Kuszell, we've found in the past that it's necessary to have a break at the end of a witness evidence so that counsel can review what he's asked the witness and consider whether there are further questions that he needs to put. We also have a break in the middle of the afternoon in any event. So we're going to have that break now. I'm going to ask you to return with the usher to the witness room. You'll come back at 25 past 3, and then counsel will tell us whether there are any more questions he'd like to put to you.
Fair enough.
All right?
Yep.
Okay, so we'd like to go to the usher then.
Yep,
Please.
thank you.
Right, 3:25, please. Yes, could we have Mr. Kuszell back, please? Thank you, Mr. Kuszell. Now, Mr. Millett, do you have some more
I
questions?
have one or two,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, in the usual way. Mr. Kuszell, you said earlier in your evidence this afternoon that there was no technical review other than within the team itself at the tender stage. Do you know what review was carried out within the team itself at the tender stage?
At the tender stage, no package of information would go out without actually senior eyes on it, which would normally be the associate or project architect lead.
But you say normally.
But normally that is the policy of the practice.
Yeah.
I mean, as a practice, we have always had a large bank of senior people in the practice. To become an associate isn't a decision that's taken lightly in the practice. Effectively, you're putting your trust into somebody at a very senior level to undertake the work. So they would be proven all-rounders. Project architects, similarly, are not entrusted in our practice to take a lead on a project unless we believe they've shown enough work experience, preferably under our auspices, and that we understand from that experience that they can actually take the project lead for the type of or scale of a project that is required.
Mr. Kuszell, I'll ask the question again because I'm not confident you've answered it. In the case of the Grenfell Tower tender, do you know whether a team review was carried out, a technical review was carried out?
A technical review in the sense that you're asking was not carried out at that stage. It was carried out later. But a review of the package that was going out to tender would have been reviewed by Bruce and maybe a colleague. That I can't be sure. You need to ask him.
And do you accept that more frequent technical reviews should have happened on the Grenfell Tower project than in fact happened?
The reason I'm hesitating is that when you have a project that gets its full technical resolution in such a graded way, it's a fine judgment when you call the technical review. In hindsight, you could argue that maybe a technical review could have been held at the tender stage, but it would have been in the knowledge that you'd have to do a further technical review because a lot would change, or indeed even some areas have not been fully resolved.
There would be no difficulty, would there, in having a technical review more than once?
No, you could have a number of technical reviews.
Mr. Kuszell, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions for this witness. Mr. Kuszell, it only remains for me to say thank you very much for coming and giving evidence to the inquiry today.
Well,
Yes.
I'm being glad to be of assistance.
Well, we're certainly very grateful to you for coming to give your evidence, and it's all over now and you're free to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
going to actually stay.
Well, you're
with my
welcome
colleagues.
to stay if you want,
Yeah,
of course.
yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, we're now going to have some movement on the council's bench. Ms. Grange is now going to take the next witness, which means that I'm going to step away from the podium for the moment, whatever it is, for the moment.
That's all right. Do you need us to rise?
Well, it's a matter for you, Mr. Chairman, but it's probably more appropriate if you did, because there's some electronics that have to be
I see.
moved around. If it's not inconvenient, would you mind?
We'll rise for a moment, but should we
Two
keep as short
minutes.
as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Right. Go on, you go again. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We're now going to call our second studio witness. That's Mr. Bruce Sounes, if he could be brought in.
Yes, thank you. Could you ask Mr. Sounes to come in, please?
I do solemnly,
Sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sounes. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. All right. Yes,
Thank
Ms.
you.
Grange.
Yes. Can you please give the inquiry your full name?
It's Bruce Alexander Sounes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence today and to assist the inquiry with its investigations. I'm going to be asking you questions today and for the next few days. If you have any difficulty understanding anything I'm saying, please ask me to repeat the question or put it in a different way. Is that okay? And can you please keep your voice up so the transcribers can hear you for the transcript? Now, you've made a lengthy witness statement for the inquiry. That should be in a folder in front of you on your desk. Can you open that up? And if we can take the screens to it, so it's SEA 000 14273, if we could bring that up. Thank you. And we see your name there, and if we could go to the very last page of the statement, at page 187, we can see your signature, and it's dated the 9th of November 2018, is that correct?
Yes.
And you've also provided Exhibit BS1, which we don't need to bring it up, but it's at SEA 000 14274. Now, have you read your statement recently?
Yes.
And can you confirm that the contents of it are true?
Yes, I can.
And have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
Yes. Well, yes.
Can you explain in what context you've had those discussions?
Mainly with our legal advisors.
We don't need to go into those. With anybody else?
With my colleagues, but not really the statement itself.
Not about the statement itself? Okay. So I'm going to start by asking some questions about your qualifications and your experience. And you've set out your experience at paragraph 17 of your witness statement. I'd like to go to that. That's SEA 30 14273 at page 7. So if we can just look at that. So you say you've worked at Studio E since 2000 and you were made an associate of the practice in 2005. And then you say, my early experience at Studio E involved a range of educational and sports and leisure projects. And then you say further details are set out in your CV. We'll come to your CV in just a moment. Focusing just a moment on the second sentence of that, when you say that your early experience at Studio E involved educational and sports and leisure projects, do you mean before the Grenfell Tower project? What do you mean there by your early experience?
These are my experiences at Studio E from 2000.
So all your experience from 2000 onwards, prior to Grenfell, was that in educational and sports and leisure projects?
I think there was some diversity there, but predominantly, yes.
Diversity over what kind of projects?
I'm trying to remember. We did some work abroad, 2010.
Would it be fair to say that educational and sports and leisure projects were your main area of work at Studio E?
Yes.
Yeah. Can we go then to your CV? We find that at SEA 000 14274 at page 2. And if we can look at the top half of that screen, thank you. So there it says at the very top that you have a PG Dip B Arch. Does that mean you've completed part 1 and part 2 of the architect qualification?
I graduated in Durban, South Africa,
Yeah.
and in Moving to the UK, to do Part 3, I had to get my qualification accredited by the ARB. So yes, they were accredited as Part 2 equivalent.
I see, yeah. And you're a registered architect. Does that mean you've completed, I think you just said this, Part 3 of the architect's qualification?
Yes.
You have completed that. Now, your CV doesn't state where and when you trained as an architect, but I think you may have just alluded to that. Where did you undertake your architect's training?
It was the University of Natal, Durban.
Yep. And when was that? When did you undertake that training?
My first year was 89 and my final year was 94.
89 to 94. Oops, sorry. And were you a member of REBA between 2012 and 2016 when you were working on the Grenfell project?
No.
Were you a member of any other professional associations or bodies at this time relevant to your work?
Just the ARB.
Just the ARB. Yeah. Now we can see from your CV there on the very left that before you worked at Studio E, you worked at an organisation called Archotech between 1995 and 1998. Did you work for them as an architect?
Yes. I'm hesitating because here, of course, it's a protected term, and I seem to recall it's a protected term there as well, but I did get the equivalent qualification, but I can't remember when. So.
And where is there? Is there in South Africa?
Yes.
In South Africa. So you work for Architect in South Africa.
Yes.
And then we've also got here KSR Architects between 1998 and 2000. Where was that?
In Camden, in London.
Camden. So did you begin working in the UK from 1998 onwards?
Yes.
And again, the KSR Architects, were you working as an architect in that firm?
The term that is used is architectural assistant before you've got your Part 3. I got my Part 3 towards the end of my time at KSR.
So sometime before 2000, you got your Part 3, did you?
I think it was between 99 and 2000, yes.
And before we come on to that, what kind of projects did you work on at those companies? So this would be Architect and KSR Architects.
Architect is primarily a refurbishment of a Victorian building that had been converted turn of the previous century into a post office. It was a protected heritage building which the post office who occupied it were making large changes, and I was involved in that for 3 years.
And did you just work on that one project during that time?
Primarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at KSR Architects in Camden, what kind of projects did you work on there?
I think a bulk of my time there was working on a residential or a hotel. Actually, I think apart hotel is the term for quite a big building in St. Paul's Churchyard, which was new build, but it was essentially recreating the mass of the historic buildings.
Yeah.
Plus I did work on a leisure centre towards the end of my time there.
Okay. And we know that you've worked at Studio E since 2000. So had you completed your Part 3 before you joined Studio E, or did you complete it after that?
I think they more or less coincide. I can't be 100% sure, but I think I started Studio E as a registered architect, or it would have been virtually simultaneous.
Yep. Thank you. And when you were first hired, did you work for Studio E LLP, or did you work for Studio E Architects Limited?
It was limited.
And in what capacity did you first start working for them?
As an architect.
And you were made an associate, your statement says, in 2005, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain in your own words how senior is an associate position within Studio E?
I think I've mentioned the assistant. Below an assistant, you would have, sorry, I'm just giving you a sense of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Below an assistant, you would have a student. Then you would have the an architect, someone who has achieved Part 3 and registered. They can be called an architect. A project architect is someone who's been given the role of fronting up a project. A senior architect may be a project architect, or they may not be. They might move between projects. And an associate sits one above them, and it's rather just a designation. It doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't. Does that? And
Yeah.
above them, of course, is a director.
So yeah, it's one director or partner? I mean, would you have referred to them while it was an LLP as a partner or a director?
No. Partner is a member of the LLP.
You were not.
Well, I don't know if you'll come on to that, but I was erroneously registered as a partner of the LLP for a few months.
But you never were?
No.
No. And have you heard of the phrase associate director? I mean, the way you just described it sounded like it was an associate and then it went straight to director. Have you heard of the phrase associate director?
I have, yes. Not one I would have used myself.
And it wasn't someone in your position? Did you ever perform the role of associate director?
I don't know what that is.
No.
No.
And would an associate normally fulfil the role of a project architect on a project?
Not necessarily, no.
So who might be the project architect? Somebody beneath the associate level?
I wouldn't want to put any restriction to who could be a project architect. I think an associate can be a project architect.
But presumably, I mean, we looked at the hierarchy a moment ago, you wouldn't have a student as your project architect. So at what level would a project architect come in?
Anyone who has qualified, fully qualified,
And what do you mean by fully qualified?
completed their Part 3 and have been registered.
So a project architect would be someone that's completed their Part 3.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Now, you've also given some details of your previous experience elsewhere in your witness statement. I just want to take you to a couple of key passages. If we can look at paragraph 271 of your statement. This is SEA 000-14273 at page 114. So in paragraph 271, it's about 8 lines down in a sentence in the middle of the page which begins, "When I met Harley." If we can just read that together. "When I met Harley, I believe I had a lingering uncertainty about PIR because this was a high-rise and I had not been involved in a high-rise before." Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now, we're going to come back to Harley and we're going to come back to PIR much later, but I just want to focus on the last part that you say there. So is it right that you had not done a high-rise residential project before Grenfell?
No.
And would it also be fair to say that you were not familiar with modern cladding materials prior to working on the Grenfell project? Would you say you were?
I think all the products that we investigated I was familiar with.
So all the projects that were investigated you were familiar with?
I think so, yeah.
Can we just look at something you say about this in your statement? If we go to paragraph 277 on page 116 of your statement. If we look in the very last lines of that paragraph, you say there, if we just pick it up halfway through, "Although at the time I would not have spent time analysing the datasheet, and I had no experience with PE composites." So is it right that before the Grenfell project you hadn't come across PE composites?
No, I had.
But you're saying you had come across other products that were used on the Grenfell exterior?
No experience at Studio E, or for that matter, my working experience, I hadn't come across the aluminium composite material in my professional experience. I had, however, come across it as a student.
As a student, I see. Okay.
That is somewhere in my statement.
Had you been involved in an overcladding project before the Grenfell project?
In other words, a building that has been overclad, yes.
Can you remember which project that might have been?
We refurbished and extended the Watford Woodside Leisure Centre, which was finished in 2008, which used a combination of composite kingspan panels and an insulated render.
Right, yeah. And was that your only experience of overcladding before the Grenfell project?
Offhand, that's the one that comes to mind, most recent, yes.
But you
I
can't think of any others, no. Can we now move to the topic of continuing professional development? Is it right that as a registered architect you're required to undertake continuing professional development?
I'll be honest, I thought the requirements for CPD fell to REBA members. I think you might correct me on that, but that was my understanding.
So your understanding is it's REBA members that have to do the CPD?
Well, obliged to under their terms of their membership, yeah.
But as a registered architect with the ARB, was your understanding that you had to do any CPD?
I'm not sure. I wasn't sure.
So I was about to ask you how many hours or points of CPD per year were you required to do? You don't know.
No.
Were you required to carry out CPD as an associate of Studio E? Did they require you to carry out CPD activities?
No, I don't think it was ever expressed or no.
So did you actually carry out, let's take the years 2012 to 2016, did you actually carry out any CPD activities during that time?
CPD was organised by the office as the lunchtime seminars, which I think is quite common, and I certainly attended many of those.
We're going to come on to those in a minute because we've got some details of those from Studio E. But apart from those lunchtime seminars that were organised by Studio E, did you do any other kind of continuing professional development, any other training, seminars, courses?
I can't think of anything offhand.
Okay. So Studio E's solicitors have disclosed a list of seminars that were organised, and we have that for the years 2011 to 2013, 2016 and 2017. The inquiry's been told by Studio E's solicitors that no training seminars were organised in 2014 and 2015. Now, does that reflect your understanding thinking back?
I can't disagree. Yeah, that sounds...
Can you recall the fact that there was no seminars at all during 2014 and 2015?
I don't... 2015?
Yeah.
I don't recall. I think 2014, I can believe that. But I thought we restarted them sooner than...
Okay, let's
24,
let's see what we can look at to help your memory. So I'm going to show you a list of those seminars. Can we go first to SEA 000 14424? And this is, as we can see from the title of the document, CPD seminars list for 2010. And if you just cast your eye down, we see the provider on the left-hand side and a description in the middle of the CPD activities.
Yeah.
Now, do you agree, just looking at the titles of those, that there aren't any seminars there which would have been relevant to either overcladding work or fire safety? Do you agree?
Yeah, I do.
And if we move on to the next list from 2011, that's at SEA 000014427. So we see these are the seminars for 2011. And there is a seminar there, 3 lines down, called Fire Safety Management and BS quadruple 9. On the we see that on the 7th of September between 1 and 2 p.m. So it's an hour-long seminar. Can you remember who gave this seminar?
No.
It says here that the CPD provider, it's called Kingfell. Do you know of an organisation called Kingfell?
No.
Is it possible that could be a typo for Kingspan? Do you recall attending a seminar that Kingspan were involved in?
No.
No. Did you actually attend this seminar?
I don't recall attending it, no. No.
So you can't illuminate us on anything about the contents of that seminar?
No.
Okay. Let's look at the next one for 2012. This is SEA 000014423. Yeah, thank you. And I'll just give you a moment just to look down those seminars. Now we can see 3 up from the bottom that there is a seminar called Using Celotex to Meet Part L 2010. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Next to Celotex, 12th of September between 1 and 2 p.m. Can you recall attending that seminar?
No, I don't.
So you can't help us on the content at all?
No.
And can you help us? Part L of the building regulations deals with what?
Conservation of heat and power.
Yeah. Let's go now to 2013. This is SEA 000014420. And if you just have a look down the descriptions of those seminars, we see at item 2, there's a seminar entitled Building Regulations Update by Butler and Young. Did you attend that seminar? Can you recall?
I don't recall, but I know Butler and Young, and that would have been one I should have targeted, but I do not recall.
You don't recall?
No.
Okay. So we skip now to 2016 because we know there were no seminars in 2014 and 2015. And we go to SEA 000014419. Now, looking at those, we can see in the first entry, there's a seminar called New CDM Regulations 2015. Do you recall attending that seminar?
I do, yes.
And can you give us an idea of the content of that seminar?
It was giving an overview to help designers understand their duties under the new CDM regulations.
Do you recall much about the content of it?
Not that I could recite here. I know they left us documentation, which
Yeah.
I think we have.
You can't recall any particular takeaway points about what your obligations would be under the 2015 CDM regs?
I think this seminar was very useful to me to understand the changes.
Yeah.
So I'll just be discussing what I understand the changes were.
Okay. Finally, let's just turn to 2017. We have SEA 000014422. And then if you look down that list, 5th line down, we've got a guide to detailing of interfaces on windows and facades, 21st of June, for an hour and a half, by Tremlo Illibrook.
Tremco, yeah?
Tremco, sorry. Do you recall attending that seminar?
I do, yeah.
And can you recall the content?
I think I can, yes. I think I suggested it.
What was it about, in broad terms?
Tremco manufacture, supply various products to assist to seal up around windows in masonry openings or metal openings, just as a way of meeting the requirements for air tightness and thermal insulation.
And was there anything about fire protection, fire safety in relation to openings dealt with in that seminar?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. This seminar was held not long after the Grenfell Tower fire. Do you think that's why this seminar was requested? Or would it have been
No.
in the diary part?
These are lined up, I think.
They're lined up before that.
Right.
Thanks. Now, prior to or during your work on the Grenfell Tower project, did you ever attend training on Part B4 of Schedule 1 to the building regulations?
No.
Part L of the building regulations of Schedule 1?
No.
Approved Document B on fire safety?
No.
How to design a rain screen cladding system? Did you undergo any kind of training in relation to that, or any kind of professional?
I can't recall anything formal, but my knowledge goes back quite a way, so there may have been.
Okay, but you can't recall anything specific?
No.
Okay, I now want to turn to consider the initial contact with Studio E about the Grenfell Tower project. Can we go to SEA 707 at page 1? And I want to look at the email at the bottom of the page. So if we can highlight that. So we can see this is an email of the 29th of February 2012 from Mark Anderson to Mr. Kuszell, your colleague. Can you just read that to yourself, and then if the transcriber can just go over the page and show you the rest of the email? We're going to come back to this email a number of times, and I want to ask you a few questions about it. So if you could just read it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Now, this is an email you would have seen, because if we go back to the top of the first page of this document, and if we look at the top of the first page, yes, we can see that you are sent this email on the 29th of February by Mark Anderson of the TMO in Mr. Kuszell's absence. Do you see that?
Yep.
So in his absence, would you please review my request below and make contact with me? Now, was that the first communication that, to your knowledge, Studio E had with the TMO in respect of the Grenfell Tower project?
Yes.
So you're not aware of any earlier communication about that project?
I think Andrzej may have discussed it with me prior, but I don't think it really registered. Not in the form that it appeared on this
Do you
email.
recall what he might have said to you before this point?
No, I'll be honest, he may have done, but my recollection was I received this email with some surprise.
Why were you surprised?
Well, they were so advanced in their thinking in terms of the scope of the project.
Right.
I was thinking maybe that they were going to talk about it.
Now, we saw a moment ago, the main email states that additionally commissions will be via the KCTMO. What did you understand that to mean? Had you heard of the TMO? Did you know who the TMO were?
I might have been, because of my involvement on KELC. I might have been aware that the Grenfell Tower was managed by a different organisation, but I can't recall exactly.
If you can, thinking back to this point, as at February 2012, what was your understanding about which organisation would be leading on commissioning the Grenfell Tower project?
Well, as per the email, that was my...
KCTMO.
That's...
Yeah. Who did you consider to be your client at this point?
I don't think we had a client yet.
Moving forward, who did you initially consider to be your client on the project?
The approach was from Mark Anderson, and Director of Assets, Investment and Engineering. He was our first point of contact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we now go, we'll come back to that email again in a moment, but can we now go to SEA 403567, which is the email you sent to Mr. Kuszell on the 29th of February 2012 after receiving that initial brief for the project. Now, we looked at this with Mr. Kuszell in detail this morning. I think you were present at that time. And you say in the final paragraph of this email, you can see it in the second sentence, "We are a little green on process and technicality, so I propose some rapid CDP, MF being my first port of call." And then you say you'll hold off circulating this. And I want to ask you some questions about that. What did you mean by a little green, to start with?
You appreciate that email arrived at 8 o'clock and I responded at 20 past 8. I was on a train coming back from Ashford. The proposal to overclad and renew the heating and the extent of works described in that email was considerable. And as I saw it, that was certainly, given that the building would be occupied, not something I could initially appreciate how that could be done. So process and technicality, at that point I was definitely thinking of how you replace windows, replace heating, completely reconfigure a building which has got all the tenants in place.
Yeah. Mr. Sounes, can you just keep your voice up, just so we can all hear? So focusing in on that word process, green on process, what were you specifically thinking? I appreciate you were on a train and this was an initial email you sent back, but thinking about what was in your mind at that point, what do you mean green on process?
How you actually, the logistics of undertaking that work with an occupied building.
Yeah.
To me, it seemed quite daunting at the time. And that's why I thought I'd ask someone who may have done it before.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. And green on technicality, again, what did you have in mind when you wrote that?
I think it was probably more thinking of the mechanical and electrical, the services. But if you were to ask me at that point, I think that's what I would have answered. But of course, there's...
A moment ago, you just mentioned the overcladding, something which was pretty significant. Did you notice the overcladding being part of the proposal at this stage?
Yes, I did.
And what did you think about that?
I thought that to overclad a building with tenants inside poses a bit of a... to an architect who's used to working on a site that's free of anyone who's not involved on construction itself, it struck me as initially a challenge.
Were you also thinking about Studio E's lack of experience on overcladding projects? Or your lack of experience on overcladding projects?
I didn't think the overcladding itself was the issue. I really thought it was the residents in place which was going to pose the biggest challenge.
Okay. And as you just mentioned, you say MF being my first port of call. Does MF there refer to Max Fordham?
It does, yes.
Now, can we just look at what you've said about this comment at paragraph 64 of your witness statement? This is at SEA 000-14273 at page 32. So you say there, in the internal email, I expressed my view that I felt Studio E was a little green on process and technicality because Studio E, as a practice, had not previously been involved in high-rise residential heating renewal nor the overcladding of occupied buildings. I said I would speak to Max Fordham to develop my understanding of the process. So we know from TMO's email that we just looked at that the principal objectives included both the overcladding of the tower and to rationalise the heating and hot water systems. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And in those circumstances, you proposed rapid CDP. Did you mean CPD, continuing professional development? And what sort of CPD did you have in mind at the time that you wrote that email?
I think nothing more than a consultation to understand the feasibility of how it could be done.
What do you mean by a consultation to understand feasibility?
With Max Fordham, someone at Max Fordham who I may have known. I don't know, I can't recall, but I thought that they would have most likely have done a project of this kind before.
And by a consultation, do you mean speaking to someone at Max Fordham?
A phone call, yeah. It would have been a phone call.
And we'll come to the discussion with Max Fordham just in a moment. Did you have any other CPD in mind at this time?
No.
Did you or the team undertake any CPD at this time?
By CPD of something that's accredited in some way, no.
Or any other form of seminars or research? Did you do anything like that at this time?
I think at that point, the research came later. I think I would have wanted to understand from someone like Max Fordham that the project proposed could be done.
If we could
That's
just
my recollection.
Just go back to the email so you've got it right in front of you. It's SEA 403567. The words you use there are, I propose some rapid CPD in the final paragraph there. What did you mean by rapid?
Rapid, as in the next day or two, before I spoke to Mark, perhaps.
Yeah. And you also say just before that you need to acknowledge receipt, ask to meet, then walk the site with him to understand the scope described, probably with Neil. Is that referring to Neil Crawford?
It must be, yeah. I can't think who else it would have referred to, yes.
Did you in fact walk the site with Neil Crawford
No.
at this time?
Not on the subsequent site visit. It wasn't with Neil.
So we know that you spoke to Max Fordham. Who at Max Fordham did you speak to?
I don't know. I don't know. I cannot recall.
Do you actually recall having a conversation with Max Fordham about the Grenfell Tower refurbishment and what was involved?
I'm pretty sure I did, but you pressed me to remember who or where. I'm not sure. I can speculate, but I'm not sure.
Can we just look at what you say about this in your witness statement? So if we look at paragraph 64 of your witness statement, that's SEA 000-14273 at page 32. And if we look 4 lines down, you say, I said I would speak to Max Fordham to develop my understanding of the process. And then you say, I learnt that they had indeed been involved in similar projects before and despite my initial uncertainty, I was comfortable that Studio E had the experience and expertise to take on the work being discussed at this stage. Do you see that? So when you wrote this statement, did you have a recollection of a conversation with Max Fordham?
As I say, I'm pretty sure I did, but the recollection of a conversation, I cannot remember the particulars or who I spoke to. And it could have been a number of individuals, so I'm not sure.
So we don't know who you spoke to. Do you know, you've given us an indication here, you learned that they had been involved in similar projects before. What else did you learn from speaking to Max Fordham? Do you recall?
I'm afraid all I can recall is that the process of overcladding and renewing the heating was something that they had been involved in before.
Why did you think that Max Fordham would be of help in that area?
Given their breadth of experience and the fact that they were sub-consulted to us on calc, and it sounded like they would be involved on the project, and the fact that I'd been working with them since I'd started at Studio E. I had
Now we know that they're building services engineers, yes? So they would have expertise in the heating system, is that correct?
Yes.
And expertise around thermal performance of a building, is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
But would you agree that they would not be able to explain to you what was required of an architect when designing an overcladding project?
I'd agree, yeah.
And you say there, looking back at paragraph 64, in the final lines, I learnt that they had indeed been involved in similar projects before, and despite my initial uncertainty, I was comfortable that Studio E had the experience and expertise to take on the work being discussed at this stage. Can you explain how this conversation made you comfortable?
Going back to the email, the concern was just the feasibility of undertaking that extent of work on an occupied building. At that point, that was the concern. Thereafter, at that stage, it was a design exercise to take on. Okay.
Now, you'd recommended to the director, Mr. Kuszell, that there would be rapid CPD. I think we've established that you personally didn't do anything other than speak to Max Fordham, is that correct?
That comment was to understand the feasibility of that type of project. Thereafter, after the meeting, after we got going, I did more research, which is obviously covered further on.
What kind of research did you do thereafter?
I started online, and obviously I can't recall exactly what I found, but I found that this type of project was a bit of a niche in the market, overcladding residential high-rises, and I came across the company CEP. I think that was a month or so later.
Yeah. So you did some online research, you found CEP, yeah. And we know, and we'll come back to this, that you have contact with CEP yeah. later down the line. Did you do any other form of research, either at this point or in the few weeks after?
I can't think of anything.
Okay. So can you explain how it was that you were able to conclude that Studio E had the experience and the expertise to take on this work?
The project was, certainly for the first year, was really a planning application, primarily. And I felt that, given that our involvement on calc and previous experience, that was something well within our and my ability to take on, negotiating the detail of the plans and the appearance of the building, making a submission, coordinating the consultants. Those are all things I felt was within my experience and ability.
So did you in fact decide that it was possible for you to learn on the job as you went through the project?
Yes.
Did you ever advise the TMO that Studio E wasn't experienced in high-rise projects or overcladding?
I can't recall doing that, no.
Or what about Appleyards, who later became Artelio? Did you ever advise them in their role that you weren't experienced in high-rise projects or overcladding?
I don't think we held ourselves out as anything other than who we were. I can't remember any conversations or anything written that set out to confirm that.
But did you ever say to them, by the way, just so you know, and you need to understand this, we aren't experienced in high-rise and we aren't experienced in overcladding? Did you ever say that to them?
I can't recall doing that, but as I say, I don't think we held ourselves out as if we had.
Do you mean by that you think it would have been obvious to those who were appointing you and using you that you didn't have that experience?
I believe so.
To your knowledge, was Studio E LLP already in financial difficulty at this time? So we're talking
2012?
early 2012. Were there financial difficulties in the firm at this time?
It's too long ago. I can't remember.
Was it the case that Studio E was eager to retain lucrative projects despite not having the expertise? Was that part of the motivation?
I think it's a bit of an unfair question. I think architects are out there to be architects, and if a project comes along and there's no reason for you not to do it, you will do it.
In your experience at Studio E, have you ever said, actually, we can't do this project, this is too much for us, or we're not right for this project, actually you should think about using X or Y? Has that ever happened?
I think it has, but usually on smaller projects.
But that's not something that occurred to you to say in the context of the Grenfell project?
No.
Can we look at paragraph 63 of your statement next? If we go SEA 000014273 at page 32. Now we're going to come back to the OJEU limit point in a moment and look at some emails around that. But for now, I want to look at what you say 2 to 3 lines from the bottom of paragraph 63. So you say, and Studio E may not be able to qualify in a bid process. Do you see that? We looked at that with Mr. Kuszell this morning. Why did you think Studio E may not have been able to qualify in a bid process at this time?
Rereading that email, it obviously doesn't mention a bid process. It just mentions the OG threshold.
Yes, but you've said in your email...
I responded perhaps...
Sorry, you said in your statement, the reason I felt that this email did not add up was that I believe the overall fee to deliver the project would be higher than the OJEU threshold, and Studio E may not be able to qualify in a bid process. It's that bit I want to ask you about. Why did you think that they wouldn't qualify in a competitive tender process?
Well, that would be relevant experience.
Yeah.
Bid process is either in 2 stages or it's broken down into quality and commercial sections, and a good deal of that is qualification with relevant experience, usually.
Yeah. Was it anything to do with Studio E's financial standing as well at that time? Or would it have been about its experience that led you to write that in your statement?
What about exposing ourselves to working at risk?
Possibly. But no, more about qualifying in a bid process. Would you have been concerned that Studio E's financial position may have been seen to be precarious at that time? No.
No, I think it was mentioned on Calc, they asked for 2 or 3 full-size leisure centres and full-size academies built within the last period, 5 years, I can't remember,
Yeah.
which was quite a high threshold, and they do that to try and whittle down the field quickly.
Yeah.
And
So if they'd done that here and they'd said, give us an example of 2 or
Yes.
3 overcladding, high-rise type projects that you've had in the last X many years, Studio wouldn't have been able to put that down, would
correct,
they?
yeah.
And given that you were aware that Studio E might not be able to qualify in a bid process, did you have any views at that stage about the expertise and resources that you would need to engage on this project?
I'm a little bit unclear if you're referring to consultants or
Either,
in-house resources.
whether additional consultants or additional expertise in other ways. Did you have any views at that stage as to what it was going to take for Studio E to be in a position to deliver this project properly and in accordance with the client's objectives?
I think the having a strong suite of consultants was critical for us to be able to deliver the project. Yes.
So you're thinking about external consultants. Were you ever thinking about hiring anyone else at Studio E, getting any additional
No.
expertise into the firm?
No.
Did the TMO ever question whether Studio E was appropriately qualified and resourced to carry out the Grenfell project?
I don't recall any questions from the TMO on that.
Or RBKC, for that matter? Did they ever query this?
Not that I can recall.
There was discussion this morning about a competence check for the Grenfell Tower project. To your knowledge, was a competence check ever carried out by the TMO or RBKC in relation to Studio E's suitability for the project?
Not that I'm aware of. What you described sounds like a formal process. I don't recall anything like that.
You don't remember that? What about the CDM coordinator on the project? That was Artelia or Appleyards up to 2015 when the CDM regs changed. Did they ever question whether Studio E was appropriately qualified and resourced to carry out the project?
No, not to my recollection.
And were you aware that the residents had questioned why Studio E had been chosen for the project?
It's too long ago, maybe.
No.
I don't.
You were in the hearing room this morning. Mr. Kuszell was shown the minutes from a Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre Residents Forum on the 28th of March. Do you remember that this morning?
Yes, I do.
And Mr. Kuszell was present, and there Mr. Defan raised a question, why was Studio E chose to do the initial work? Do you recall being made aware of that at the time?
No.
And just to finish off on these questions, were you ever asked to justify Studio E's suitability for this project to anyone?
No, not that I can recall.
Okay, can we go now to paragraph 65 of your statement? That's SEA 000014273 at page 32. And I want to look about 8 lines down at the sentence beginning, the knowledge that Ledbetter. So there you say, the knowledge that Ledbetter, Bouygues, a large design and build contractor, would be engaged on the project was reassuring, as we could expect specialist subcontractors to be involved from the outset. We felt more than able to take on the lead designer role, as we had on Calc. I believe that KCTMO did later enter into some form of agreement with Ledbetter, etc., etc. So just focusing on what you've said there, you refer to taking comfort in the fact that Ledbetter and Bouygues would be engaged in the contract and that they would appoint subcontractors, specialist subcontractors. Was it therefore your intention from the outset to rely on the expertise of specialist subcontractors for these works?
I think my experience is that on virtually all public-funded projects, the project is taken through a design and build route, which transfers all responsibility onto a main contractor, design responsibility. So were we relying on that knowledge? I guess we were to some degree, yes.
I'm going to come back to what you've just said in a moment about design and build, but the question I asked you was it your intention from the outset to rely on the expertise of specialist subcontractors for these works?
I couldn't say we would. We certainly would have expected a specialist subcontractor to be engaged by Leadbetter as soon as they were appointed. But whether that was our intention or the contractor's intention, I don't think I can answer that.
I mean, you've said here in your statement that it was reassuring the knowledge that you were going to get Leadbetter, a large design and build contractor, on the project. Can you just help us in what way was that reassuring for you?
A large contractor obviously has a large number of specialists' experience to draw on. Certainly more than I would, or we would, as a single firm of architects. And, sorry, back to your question.
Yeah, no, it was why it was reassuring that you've got the Leadbetter or Bouygues engaged on the project. Why was that reassuring to you at this stage?
It's reassuring that we wouldn't be expected to design all the detail.
So you'd be looking for them or their subcontractors to help with the design of the detail, yes?
If that's how they chose to do it. Yeah.
And at that stage, would you have thought of the overcladding as design detail?
Yes.
You would?
Yes.
So did you think you were going to be doing any design of the overcladding yourselves?
By that, I mean, we designed from the get-go, but if you're referring to the final designer, the fine design that you do towards construction, we would not expect to be doing that. No.
Right. And you referred earlier... Sorry, carry on.
I think that would be true on most projects, even traditional projects. I think we would have sought to have the envelope as a contractor's design element, contractor's design portion. Sorry, it's a bit off topic. But
does that mean that you are expecting them effectively to take the ultimate responsibility for the design?
Of that element.
Of that element?
Yes.
And you not have responsibility for it?
No. No.
Just that it was reassuring that they would have that as well.
To complete the design, you expect the subcontractor to take that on. Okay.
And you talked earlier about design and build, and you've talked about it here. You've said in almost all public procurement contracts, the expectation is it would be a design and build. At the outset of your involvement in the Grenfell Tower project, did you think it was likely to be a design and build procurement?
Yes, that original email, I think, alludes to it.
Yeah. So that was always in your thinking?
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, if I can just finish this run of questions.
How long do you think you might take to do that?
About 2 minutes, max.
Well, if it's only 2 minutes, of course.
Thank you. Do you agree that Studio E was under an express duty to ensure that the firm organised itself effectively in terms of the preparation and resourcing for what was, for the practice, a new and challenging type of project?
Sorry.
I'll say it again, sorry. It is a long
questions.
Do you agree that Studio E was under a duty to ensure that the firm organised itself effectively in terms of preparation and resourcing for what was, for the practice, a new and challenging project?
So, second phrase is...
Did you think you had a
does
duty
that
to organise yourself effectively and to resource properly for what was effectively a new and challenging project that you'd not done before?
Yes, I would agree with that for any project.
Can we just go to the REBA Handbook of Practice Management? This is the 9th edition. That's at INQ 000110309. And if we go within that, this is the May 2013 edition of the REBA Practice Management Handbook. And if we go to page 37 and have a look at paragraph 2.1.1, is there a way of blowing that up? Yeah. Can you read that on the screen? Can you see that?
Yeah.
If you look at the right-hand side of the page, and if you look at Principle 2, competence in the blue box. There we go, yeah. And can you see there, it says, in the performance of their work, members shall act competently, conscientiously, and responsibly. Members must be able to provide the knowledge, the ability, and the financial and technical resources appropriate for their work. Do you see that there? And can we look over at page 38, at paragraph 2.2 on the left-hand side? If we can zoom in a little bit on the lower half of that left-hand side of the page, we see there at 2.2, members should realistically appraise their ability to undertake and achieve any proposed work. They should also make their clients aware of the likelihood of achieving the client's requirements and aspirations. If members feel they are unable to comply with this, they should not quote for or accept the work. Now, did you at any stage on the Grenfell project, and in accordance with those guidelines, conduct a realistic appraisal of Studio E's ability to undertake the work involved?
Sorry, Studio E or myself?
Studio E. Do you remember any kind of appraisal taking place as to whether or not Studio E could undertake and achieve the work?
I'm afraid I can't think of any document that
Okay.
would constitute an appraisal.
Or any kind of informal appraisal?
I think I just have to go back to my statement. I think we as a group felt that it was within our ability to service the project.
Okay, let's pause there. Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
Good. Well, Mr. Sounes, we're going to break now for the day. We're going to have to ask you to come back tomorrow to continue giving your evidence. And I'm also going to have to ask you, please, not to talk about your evidence or the subject matter of your statement at all with anyone else while you're in the course of giving evidence. Is that all right?
Yeah.
And we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow. All right. If you'd like to go with the usher, she'll look after you. Good. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please. Thank you.